Based in Hawaii, Mary Babcock is a fiber and installation artist whose work explores mending and its implications for cultural change. The grounding point for her work is in the metaphors derived from fiber processes such as stitching, binding, weaving, piecing, and the overarching concept of mending. She is interested in how precise application of fiber metaphors may heighten our understanding of both peace building and of fracturing in the foundations for social justice.
Aloha mai kako. My name is Jaimey Faris, and I'm the curator of Inundation. And today I wanted to take you on a quick virtual studio visit to Mary Babcock studio in Kailua. So welcome, Mary. It's so nice to see you in your virtual studio in your backyard, and I see your studio back there. So Mary, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm an artist, I'm a mom, and I teach at UH Manoa and sculpture and expanded practices there. Yeah.
And do you have, your studio is right behind you in the space? Do you work there a lot?
Yeah, I'm really lucky. My studio is right in my home, right looking out onto my garden and like looking out onto the mountains too. So that's always been really important to me. I think like my art life and my family life and my life are very interconnected. Mm-hmm. So that's always been important to me to have sort of my own space at home where I can interface in between like my regular life and my art life really fluidly.
So I want to get into that interconnection in a little bit, but first I'd like to talk about Lotic Sea I and II, the pieces that you made for Inundation. So you made two pieces, one gorgeous immersive piece for the space at the UH Art Gallery, and the other one a smaller piece for the intimate kind of feeling of Donkey Mill. So could you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking when you started working on Lotic Sea?
Sure. So I came to Hawaii, maybe 16 years ago now, to a place that I really knew nothing about at all. And, I think in the past few years, the issue that just is like front and center in my mind all the time is what's happening with climate change. And living in the Pacific was specifically what's happening to the space that I live, but not just the space I live, but the space that we share, where the ocean touches all those different sort of land masses, many of which I hadn't even heard of before I moved here. So when I was invited to be part of Inundation, really thinking about what's happening with sea level rise and the interconnection between what's happening way up north with the melting of the glacial areas up north, and the impact that has on our seas, and then the interconnection between that too. So what happens when the salt water of the seas touches the ices and how that speeds the ices coming into our oceans. And so I think with Inundation, the challenge that was out before me was that I'm not really of this place. I'm not from this place. But I'm in this place now and trying to understand it very much as an outsider. So it felt important to me to sort of speak from the place of trying to understand this place from the outside. And so much of the dialogue that in my research was about really what's happening with these larger countries in their perhaps humanitarian, perhaps not so philanthropic interests in many of the Pacific Islands. And the specific interest always is economic interest. Now it's not so much as cultural interests. So Lotic Sea I was really trying to talk about that, of the immensity of this sort of issue of climate change and sea level rise, and how so much of the dialogue is centered on the economic interests of large countries into smaller countries, and not so much of the sort of human to human interest. And then I guess Lotic Sea II, it felt like I really did need to do a separate piece there. So I focused more specifically, I sort of scaled it way down and focused specifically on some of the spaces of the different islands again, and the contrast between the scale of the economic zones that we focus on, and the almost having the sort of the islands themselves in the dialogue, not in reality, but in the dialogue, sort of disappearing away.
So one of the fantastic things about the piece is how subtle your rhythm, your touch is in the pieces, because of these immense, especially Lotic Sea I for the gallery, the UH gallery, was this immense expanse of wax paper with very small or subtle stitching happening to outline the EE zones and some of the islands in the Pacific. So I wanted to talk first about what EE zones mean to you and what you were interested there in terms of your interest in economies. And then second, your choice of materials, because I think the kids were so amazed at what you could do with very simple materials like wax paper and stitching and salt. So first, the EE zones, like especially in terms of mining, I think some of your interest is about seeing the interrelationship between mining, both in the deep sea and in the Arctic North, and climate change. So can you talk a little bit about that relation?
Yeah, it's complex, and I think sort of, how do I say that? I think one of the things that I do, and many of us do as an artist, is we sort of try to integrate all this very complex discursive analysis into a sort of poetry. And so I think that's what I'm trying to do, especially in Lotic Sea I. In terms of the EE zones, so I'm interested in sort of the politics of power there. So the exclusive economic zones surround the islands and are determined, or at least originally, in terms of a certain number of miles from the coasts, from the coastline of the islands. And within that zone, the countries have a kind of jurisdiction of what can happen in terms of development that's different than the open seas. And so, of course, countries who are being threatened, particularly by climate change, that have limited resources, it appears at least that they are being targeted by larger countries who are coming in with all sorts of economic aid, and at the same time eyeing those exclusive zones for mining of metals that they couldn't legally do on the open seas. So, for example, some of the copper and other metals that are other metals that are mined there that are used in things like our cell phones and our solar panels and all the things that we can do to sort of be green in developed countries. So I was interested in sort of highlighting that it seems, again, that philanthropic interest may be much more self-serving than it appears on the outside.
And
yeah.
so,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a huge issue, and a layered issue on top of an already complex issue of climate change. And so one of the things that I think we all wanted to address in Inundation was how we deal with the emotional impact of these huge issues, and how we then begin to process the complexity of those things and then begin to act. And so I see your work as addressing scale in that you're taking these very, as you said, very complex discourses, but then also creating something that happens at your scale, in your studio, in your life. And so can you talk a little bit about how you think about scale and the importance of working the way that you do on very complex issues?
Right. So I guess it's, thinking about how to embody these issues in a certain way. So what I just described is a very intellectual stance, and I can be bothered by it, but it's very intellectual, right? It's about numbers, it's about politics, it's about economics. But it also affects, when I take it in at a sort of a very personal level of like how we as humans treat ourselves and others. And so I guess I'm really trying to bring those issues down to a very intimate scale, and doing that through the use of materials. So using materials that are seen to, that are quite fragile. Wax paper is so interesting always to me because it's a material that's meant to preserve things, but it's super fragile. Um, and so bringing it down to like the scale of things we're familiar with, things that wrap our food, things that our body can touch, and then working those materials in a really sort of intimate way too. So like for me, hand stitching, it's like a really quiet, it's like, it's the kind of work that, at least in my life, was done when I'm mending something that's been tattered and torn. You know, it's like I rarely hand stitch something from the beginning in my life, but I do hand stitch to sort of repair. So for me, it has that intimacy of, you know, we repair things that have value to us, and in that repair, we also create value, right? So like my things that I've repaired multiple times now have a kind of intimate, I have an intimate connection to them that I don't if I just go out and get something new. So I think I'm thinking at that level. Same with pin pricking, you know, it's like, you know, it's like, it's a, so the islands were pin pricked into the wax paper, and it's very quiet. It's very quiet. I have to really pay attention. I have to really know where I am in my body in this present point in time. And so I guess I'm trying to take these sort of abstract notions and use the materials to help like myself and viewers experience that at a much more sort of personal, embodied sort of level.
I also think the kids that I gave tours to for the first iteration of Inundation were so impressed at what you could do with very simple, low tech, cheap materials, right? They think of art as painting, ceramics, photography, and they saw this piece, they gravitated towards it. And then when I was asking them what it was, they were like, well, it's wax paper. Oh my gosh. And so we talked a lot about the metaphorics of wax paper too, that you're also thinking about the way that wax melts and using the iron to melt the wax paper together. So there's these very cool layers to your work in terms of the way you're addressing large scale issues, metaphors, and then the way that you treat the materials itself. I also was wondering how you were thinking about the audience in engaging the piece too. How did you want to invite them into the space and to see see all of those different layers together?
Yeah.
What
So that's a interesting question. Yeah. So I guess scale was really important to me. I really wanted the sea to have a large sort of space and voice, and or presence, I guess, a sense of presence. Number one, where, you know, the sense of feeling small and humbled a bit in relationship to the scale of the space. The original sort of installation plan was a much tighter space and much more confrontational. And then when it was in the gallery, I realized that the sense of just his presence was really important. It didn't need to be a confrontation. It needed to be a player sort of in the dialogue within the gallery. And so it sort of decided for me that it was a more gentle interaction, I think, with the viewer, yet still like, for me, like for me, the work read as a very sort of powerful presence, and that was enough actually.
And then the piece for Donkey Mill, I know, was a challenge because of traveling the piece and the difference of scale of that space. Can you talk a little bit about how you were thinking about translating the concept, even because you couldn't get the immensity of scale with the sheet in the same way?
Yeah, it felt like that just was not the right space for the, like it couldn't just take that piece and put it in a different space. It wasn't gonna work. And so I decided to work, you know, on smaller sort of plates that are almost like um, floating ice pieces. And and I wanted to keep, you know, in the UH gallery, there's salt on the floor where the sort of ice or the wax paper meets the ice of the ground. And I wanted to keep the salt involved. And so I actually painted the wax paper and embedded salt into it, which has been really interesting. And I feel really grateful that Donkey Mill is as flexible as they are, because they're living pieces. Because the salt, of course, constantly is pulling water, and it's pulling water from the air, much more than here in Oahu. So they're every day, they're changing. And the sort of salt pattern on the ones was taken from different parts of the border of Greenland and the ice sheets in Greenland. So it's super interesting how that's all changing, right? Like, because the salt, which is like the border, is actually encroaching more and more and taking over the pieces, which is, I love. And I love that they've been so flexible to allow that to happen.
I'm going to be so curious to see what they look like in October when the show is over.
Right? Because it's like, it's intense, right? It's really pulling. So they're you know, they're literally pulling water from the air.
Amazing. So you mentioned earlier that your art practice, your family, your garden, your life in general are all just kind of intermingled and an extension of each other. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what you're experiencing right now in this time of COVID-19, of coronavirus, where we're all taking a pause and reevaluating our lives. And I know for you, gardening and farming in other community spaces has been a really important part of that. And I know you take your family with you too. So I wanted to ask you a kind of specific question about that. What you think, or what you see the relationship between the way that you work with your hands in the studio and working in these farming spaces and working on your own, in these community farming spaces and working in your own garden. What does working with your hands in all of those capacities mean to you?
It's very humbling, all of it. You know, like gardening is the most humbling experience, second maybe to art. I don't know, because there's so much failure. No, and being able to be comfortable with failure, actually, and the pace of sort of human scale life. So, you know, in my attempts to transform my yard into an edible landscape, I realized just how much I consume all the time, actually, like how hard it is to grow food that could sustain me, at least here in a place I don't know that well. And so, you know, I think that's really interesting, and I think that's true with my work and my materials too. So like I'm typically using reclaimed materials or domestic materials, partly because I grew up with a family where, you know, my grandparents emigrated from Ireland during the potato famine, you know, so you saved everything and you didn't waste anything. And so I think a lot of my materials are like that too, of like, what can we do with the refuse we produce to create value, instead of continuing to create more surplus, you know, like that's a huge part of the climate change problem, right? It's that we're constantly over consuming everything all the time, you know, and so I think they're related in that way of like, what is it like to, I mean, I don't live in any kind of human scale. I'm so dependent on everything, right? Like it's ridiculous, and how much material I think I need to live. But at least challenging that some, you know, it's like, what does it mean to, what if I have to live off my yard? Like, what's that like? And what if I can't buy art materials, or why would I buy art materials when they're being thrown out all the time, you know? So I think they're very related in that way. And just time too. It's like, I've been repairing my chairs with with binding strips. And, you know, it takes a crazy amount of time. And I sit there and like swear at myself for wasting all my time, but like, what else would I be doing with it? You know what I mean? Like, how is it we decide something's a waste of time? You know, how is taking time to mend your clothes a waste of time? It's only a waste of time because I can buy them cheaper someplace else, and somebody trained me to think that's a better thing to do. So I think it's like a constantly redefining, like, you know, time is even valued now, right? Like time is commodity, but redefining that, I think, as well. I don't know if that makes answers.
I know we've talked in the past about the importance of body world wisdom to you,
Yeah.
the importance of body knowledge or procedural knowledge.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that in relationship to
Sure.
farm and gardening?
Yeah.
Farm.
So procedural knowledge, right, is that knowledge we learn by the actions that our bodies actually take. And so, you know, an example of that for me, one of the clear, you know, like in my weavings, I do a lot of unplying, cleaning, unwinding of the material before I can even start to create. And that's taught me a lot about human relationships, of, you know, the sort of pre-work that has to be done, or the sort of regulatory work that has to be done, of untangling problems, slowing down, that you can't even begin to work until things are sort of, the materials worked a bit. And so so I've learned those kinds of things. And I think in, you know, and like gardening too, it's like pruning. I'm a like horrible pruner. I just like don't do it, but I would be so much better off if I did it in my life, right? You know, you just like, you take that risk of cutting things away and having less, and then you have this great bounty. And if you don't, everything's overwrought and over entangled, and nothing grows because you're trying to do too much, right? Like if I could actually take that body knowledge in, I'd do better, right? Or working with the wax paper, like I have to be, my being has to be settled enough so that I can work with really fragile materials without ripping the whole thing apart. And so like the materials actually train me how to calm myself, so that like in human interactions that are also often fragile, right? Even in places of tension, just like in those places of tension where I can't reach under the wax paper, like how to get used to like, okay, this is an impossible task, but I've done this before, so I can do it. And sometimes I've done it before on wax paper, so that when I'm like facing my kid, I know that I can get through an apparently impossible situation and come out the other end, or repair it at the end if I don't. So like, I think they interface, I think, a lot.
So what I hear you say is that it gives you body memory for patience and endurance, and all kinds of opening capacities that we need, especially in our present moment, which is really powerful. I find that really powerful.
Yeah.
If we could end on just one last question about what gives you hope or satisfaction right now. Is there something in the past few weeks that you've been doing that you find really satisfying and hopeful in doing in this current climate?
I think like a lot of artists, it's all the artists I talk to are like, I don't know how to work in this time. You know, there's a lot of like, it's sort of like somebody dies, it feels like you don't know what you're supposed to do for a while, right? And so it's a funny, silly little project, but I've started shredding the newspapers and weaving them back together, and then superimposing some paintings over the top. And I think for me, that different way of digesting all the constant, like sort of repetitive headlines that I seek out daily and reread the same thing over and over and expect to sort of think something different, has been incredibly helpful to like literally shred those and reweave them into a pattern. And then also superimposing, I think, starting to think of sort of the power of playing around with botanical drawings, and you know, reading about how plants communicate with one another, and thinking about you know, learning again from nature and nature's resilience. And I think, you know, in the garden, there's always things going wrong, but there's always things going right too. And, you know, thinking about perspective, you know, it's like, where do we fit in this big picture? And humility, you know, like, where do we fit in this big picture? That, you know, the garden is growing lush, it just might not be growing lush with what I want, right? So like, how do we, I guess, with climate change and COVID and all that, like, where are the spaces in which there's transformation happening? It may not be the way I want it in my best interest, but that yeah, there's something bigger than me.
Thank you so much, Mary, for sharing your studio, your garden space, and your art with us. We'll see
Thanks,
you soon.
Jaimey. Okay, thanks.